It's 6 o'clock right now.
All right, 6 o'clock, it's time for us to get started. I want to thank you for showing up tonight for round two of the history of Estill County. And as I said, we don't do PowerPoint, so have a set agenda. We're going to ramble a little bit, if that's okay. As I said before, this is primarily my sixth grade social studies class before Sheriff. I want to introduce Mr. Scott Bledsoe tonight, who's going to help present, and Mr. John Markham, who items are on this table over here, along with some of mine, and Scott's are here. And tonight, when this is over with, we'll hang around a few minutes, and I brought some books that I wanted to share with you. Some of you have asked about my sources and where I get a lot of this information out of my attic, which looks like that. I was asking her because I've been up there piling through it, but I wanted to just touch base again on the paleo time. I did not bring this last week. I had it laying out. Of all the things, you would not have thought that they used a blowgun. And this is simply a thistle. See, I can't shoot this in here. I don't want to shoot your eye out. And cane. Kentucky was known as the Canes. Not much of it's left. If you go down around the creek, and if you go down the river in a boat, you will see it. But when Simon Kenton first came in here, and boom, they called this area, and it was referred to as the Canelands. And I want to touch on Boone when I get started tonight. Now we're going to jump from the Stone Age to the Middle Age, and that's what we did with the Native Americans. We literally, the Europeans, it was a slow process to go from the Stone Age to the Middle Age. But last week, I quoted you a statement about the Stone Age. It was ceaseless toil, hunger, constant warfare, and early death. Well, not a whole lot changed after the early pioneers went into the Middle Age. And the reason they called them long hunters is because they were gone long periods of time, sometimes years. And on one of Boone's long hunts, he came home and found a son he didn't know he had. But he said, at least it's a Boone by his brother. So he took, and one thing about Boone is his patience. He did not anger easily. Boone was not the killer that he's portrayed. He did not wear a coonskin cap, didn't like it. Boone was a Quaker. He says he only killed 3 Indians in his life, knowingly. One of them on a creek in Estill County, Locust Branch, that was just allegedly fishing and minding his own business, and he regretted that. And I think we know about where that rock's at. It's still there in the creek. But talking about Boone, how did Boone find out about Kentucky? Boone was a staunch Quaker. They actually put his family out of the Quakers because one of them married a non-Quaker. But Boone got the call to arms when he was in Pennsylvania. A fort had come up at the forks of the old highway. Fort Duquesne, the French built. So they mustered them into the militia. This was the beginning of the French and Indian War. It was 1755. Boone hired on as a hostler, and he met a man by the name of John Finney. Now they tried to talk to Bradford. You know, we call them the Redcoats. They had the crosses with the white crosses with their equipment, a good target. And they tried to talk to Braddock and say, look, we don't need to go marching in with these drums beating and fife blowing. And he said, we have a Delaware over here that's willing to lead us up to Fort Duquesne, but he wants to do away with the flash in the show. His name was Shingus. He asked Braddock, said, what do you intend to do with this area of Pittsburgh? It was what we know as Pittsburgh, is Duquesne and the Ohio Valley, the Spele-Wapiti, as they call the Ohio River. And Braddock just pretty much told him what we're gonna do with this land's none of your business. And it ain't gonna be your hunting grounds. And he dissed him. He treated him awful, so he took his men and left. Now, the first week they only made 30 miles. They were clearing roads for wagons. Now you think about this, he had 2,000 men in a line that stretched for 4 miles. And again, they were beating drums and they were blowing fifes. That was their signal, just like a bugler was in our cavalry. Well, I've had to take some notes. On the way, they weren't making any progress. So he said, we're going to have to leave part of this baggage. And 1,000 of them went on, actually close to 1,400, about 1,000 of them that were regulars and about 400 militia people. And this was June, or in July, late July. The redcoats, the Virginians were wearing coats of blue. They carried cannons. Well, the men in Fort Duquesne, they were actually about 1,400 people around Duquesne, but they only had room inside for 200. And they knew that the British were coming with artillery, and they were ready to surrender. And one of the men in the fort, an officer in the fort, he says, we can't give this fort up, let's go meet it. So they waited for Braddock in a horseshoe-shaped ambush. Now, again with Boone, he was steadfast. George Washington was riding with him, was in command. And at this instant, I will touch on Washington a little bit. This is where Washington had the 2 horses shot from underneath him, and the bullets went through his coat. Well, the Indian that was shooting at him, they thought he was protected by the gods. And come to find out, the gun barrel was bent. Because these gun barrels were not constructed, many of them, they simply wrapped wire around an iron rod and heated it and hammered it together. So the massacre started and went on for 3 hours. And boom, they got word that Braddock said, hold your line. We're going to need you all in a few minutes. And people started deserting around Boone and leaving. And he sat there and he sat there. And there was an officer in the British Army and his son were literally shot off their horses beside Boone before he got down, cut his mule out of the traces, and took off. Well, he started home. He left on foot. He did not have a gun. And this is the first Indian that he killed. He was not far from his house. He was going back to Pennsylvania, and he started to cross a bridge. And there was a drunken Indian about halfway there. And he had a weapon. And he threatened Boone, told Boone he was going to kill him. And Boone roared his head and butted him just like a goat and caught him under the ribs and pushed him up over this bridge. So that was the first Indian he killed. The first one he didn't even kill with the gun. So Boone doesn't see Finley for a while. And then lo and behold, Finley shows up in his neighborhood. He's a peddler. And he admits that he is not a woodsman. They were often referred to as tinkers. And he kept telling Boone, and I'm going to read to you here for a few about what Finley told Boone. The tall tales anticipated John Filson's more grandly elegant Kentucky, the land of promise, flowing with milk and honey, where you shall eat bread without scarceness and not lack anything. Exaggeration seemed to come with the territory. No stranger, there's no place on the universal earth like old Cane Tuck. A later pioneer would declare, as she whips all out west in prettiness, and you might bow down creation and not get enough. What a buzzle is amongst people about Kentucky, wrote Virginia during the 1770s. To hear people speak of it, one would think it was a newfound paradise. The most sublime Edenic comparison came into a sermon of a frontier preacher who, wishing to convey to his congregation the glories of the afterlife, sang, "Oh, my dear honeys, heaven is a Kentucky of a place." 65 years after hearing these tales, Finley's description remained vivid to Boone. And he couldn't resist it. Boone was not a farmer. He hated working the land. And here's where you ladies need to be recognized, because you aren't mentioned in these books. But when these guys took off on these long hunts, who took care of the homestead? Who chopped the wood, planted the crops? And you don't hear that. Had it not been for the women staying home and taking care of the lands that we had already claimed, there would not be the United States. So we owe the quote housewife a whole lot that we haven't given credit for. Now, Boone and Finley left for Kentucky on a May Day, 1769. John Stewart, they had 3 assistants. Now, I brought a picture that I want to show you. Some years ago, I walked into Martin Station, who Boone met Josiah Martin on the other side of Cumberland Gap in Virginia. And I walked in, and this painting is called Station County. And I told the guy there, I said, I know where that place is at. Kind of looked at me. He knew too, but he didn't tell me. And he said, "Oh, you do?" He said, "Where is it?" I said, "It's in Estill County." He said, "Every long hunter had a Station County." I said, "Yeah, but ours stood. We have a name, and we do. It's still called Station Camp to this day. But this is Station Camp, Deer Skins and Dogs. You can see the half-face camp and the dogs. And these long hunters, they all had their dogs. 3-dog night. I know where that term comes from. It ain't just a band that we used to have fun to. There's a journal of a guy laying in a canebrake down near Cumberland Gap. He had stepped on a stalk in that canebrake, had a big hole in his foot. He lay there almost 2 weeks. He talked about him scraping the dead flesh out of it while he could hear the Indians. They tunneled back in the canebrake and made a camp because he couldn't get out of it. He said that that night, cometh light snow and the temperature dropped so hard that we put all 3 dogs under the blanket for it. It was a 3-dog night. This is for deodorant, neither soap. You got to remember the toilet paper. So, they were quite rough. Here are the bales of furs that they have up high. And as you can see, here is a guy that is scraping the hair from the hide. They didn't flesh them like we do in the sense. They wanted the hair off of them. And again, we showed you all last week, we talked about why do we call $1 a buck? Well, at this time, these tanned and cleaned skins were worth 40 cents a pound. 2.5 pounds is about what they got off of a deer after they shaved all the hair and everything off of it. So a deer hide is worth $1. So that's why we call a buck a buck. I will have this picture. Like I said, we're going to mill around here after this is over with. And to have a magazine I need to show you too, that, and I'm going to have some books out here. The compass. It is the book, a magazine of Boone's descendants. And I'm going to leave this up here in case any of you want to roll. And I don't mean to call you out, but Doug Rogers, would you stand up for a minute for me? You put this man in buckskin and gave him a long rifle, he's a spitting in Daniel Boone. This is the only known painting of Boone in life, right here. And Doug, if I'm not mistaken, your genealogy has Boone in it, does it not? Are you all related to the Boones? George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark. But Boone was about the same size as Doug, same color of hair, complexion. Like I said, when you describe him, they're describing our Doug Rogers today. What time is it, Ronnie? 6:15. I don't want to ramble too much. At this time, I'm going to let Scott Bledsoe present. He is in native attire, and he gave me this. I meant to show you. This is made out of linen, you say? Now, this is what Boone probably would have been wearing, something of this nature. As a hostler or a teamster. Boone could do about anything. He was a gunsmith, could shoot horses, just a matter of anything he needed to do to survive. So at this time, I want to let Scott give an explanation, and I'm going to go over and take a seat. What he has up here on the table, and if you want to stop us and ask questions, you may.
I already have 2 questions whenever you're ready.
You want to take them now? All right. What questions do you have?
Okay, so we had one earlier. How long was Boone gone from his wife when she had a child by his brother?
He was gone over a year. Boone didn't have a calendar or a watch. I mean, I'm not being a smart at it, you know.
Right.
He's gone over 9 months.
Right. Here we go. We got one more.
He was gone about 18 months on that particular time.
And one more question. And someone said, isn't one of Boone's relatives buried behind Francie Snowden on Main Street?
No, I don't think, maybe there could be, but there is. Is Francie here? Richard, is there?
There's a child buried there, named Daniel Boone Stewart. I think that's his name. Show, that's it. But they tried to say that was his grandchild. I don't think that's true.
But there is one born, buried up at Old Landing. What's the name of it? Go. It is, because I've been there and seen it. I know you have too. Yes. So,
Okay, I will start by introducing myself. My name is Scott Bledsoe. I'm a local historical reenactor. Do a small amount of that stuff along with some historical tracks. In a short while, I'll get into some of the clothing and attire that would be expected of a long hunter in the time period. But first, I want to kind of touch a little further on Boone and John Finley, as Mr. Skip Johnson here previously spoke on. In the French Indian War, Boone was also known as a Wagoneer, the same thing that John Finley was known as. This is known as a Wagoneer's cross. This would have been the top layer of clothing that Boone and Finley would have wore whenever they were moving supplies for the war effort. Coupled with this would have been their normal clothing, consisting of shoes, stockings, breeches, shirt, and a waistcoat, or what we now call a waistcoat. During their travels with the war effort, John Finley himself and Boone got fairly familiar with the northern territories of the United States. You're talking areas of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Whenever Boone would move back to North Carolina, primarily in the Yadkin Valley, Finley would stay to the north and open a trade company to where he was essentially a traveling salesman. During his times, there's a report of Finley being captured by Native Americans, and would eventually make his way into an area that we now know as Indian Fields. This is Clark County, Kentucky. During his capture, there was times that he was taken out by war parties and showing different routes in central and eastern Kentucky. Eventually, he would break loose. He would go back and continue his trade routes. And over these trade routes, in roughly 1768 or 69, he would come in contact with Boone in the Yadkin River Valley. He would be there for the majority of the winter, as Boone would request that he just stay and winter up there. But during this time, he would talk extensively with Boone about entrances through a southern pathway into Kentucky. This is what would cause Boone to become interested enough to make an excursion into the state of Kentucky later on to see, in his words, the level of Kentucky. As Skip Johnson spoke previously, they left sometime around the beginning of May, made it here roughly June 6th or June 7th. They would set up a station camp in the area that we now know as Station Camp, Estill County, Kentucky. Their primary route would have brought them through the Moccasin Gap near the Holston River Valley of Virginia, through the Clinch, Powell Valley, across the Cumberland Gap, following the Cumberland River down to the Rockcastle River, follow the Rockcastle River north to about Berea. From there, they would make their way on over to Red Lick. At the time, Station Camp and Red Lick both were known as two different forks of Red Lick Creek. The reports showed that Boone and his peers set up a station camp at the forks of the Red Lick Creeks, just short of the Kentucky River and the Buffalo Run. Now, I can't nail down the exact spot to the meter where this place is at, but generally speaking, I would say that it's somewhere around the end of the straight stretch near Eddie Ballard's place, near the Station Camp Church. It's somewhere in that valley. Okay. From there, he would go on. Him and another fellow would go on and do some exploration in the area. That same day, he's reported as to making it to Powell County, Kentucky. Clay City, as a matter of fact, a place known as Pilot Knob. I've been up this mountain a few times myself, actually doing period trek. And that's where that Boone was quoted in seeing the level of Kentucky, and also later on mentioning that Kentucky must be a heavenly type of place, or heaven must be a Kentucky type of place. Once he's seen the bluegrass region itself, the level fields, the rolling hills, and the resources that it offered, he knew that this was a place that he wanted to come back to. Once they made it back to the station camp, the majority of his crew had left back out for Virginia, heading back to the Yadkin River Valley. But he was left here, him and John Stewart, was left here and stayed on. I think the reports is over a year, close to 2. This would have been the same time period that he had a child fathered by his brother. Because long hunts at the time, generally speaking, a long hunter, this was a profession, it wasn't a pastime. But this was a supplemental way to make extra income. Most of these guys carried jobs outside of that, whether they were farmers, blacksmiths, or whatever else that was essential to the eastern frontier or the western portion of Virginia at the time. These guys would generally work from spring to fall, and most of their long hunts would take place over the winter months once the majority of their work was done. They would come in here. One thing that they would do is try to acquire meat to supplement food for the family. Another thing is supplement income by retrieving hides and taking them back and selling them to traders. Another thing that's not so much spoken about with these guys is the looks for later acquiring land. You have to think that people on the eastern frontier, the western expansion of Virginia at the time, settlements and all that, they weren't necessarily wealthy people. These were more downtrodden, down to earth, poor people that essentially found their place in that location because they didn't have the means to provide for themselves in other ways. Land was cheaper the further out that you got. And outside of purchasing land themselves, which most of these people did not have the money to do, the only other real way to acquire land at that time and, assure some type of future for their family was as a land tenant. But unfortunately, that required leases, and these people weren't the most educated people, and they weren't lawyers. So the likelihood of being able to acquire land through tenants was highly unlikely. So to be able to go into unclaimed territories and claim a piece of land was essentially their only way to ensure a future for their family. Although these claims were hit or miss at times later on in history. But outside of that, we'll start talking about some kit. Me, myself, I'm dressed as a long hunter right now. This is part of the normal kit that you would see. These guys would come in and set up station camps. These station camps would have been a primary headquarters for them to go out and do their things. Once they got set up, built the station camp, had the things that they need, they would all went in different directions, looking for resources, whether that's hides, whether that's water, springs, minerals, whatever else that they needed. Some of the attire that you would have seen on Long Hunter at the time, of course, as Mr. Kit Johnson stated, the coonskin cap, that's a myth. That's something that come on later through 19th century.
Parker.
Yeah, pretty much. And the political aspect of Davy Crockett himself later on. But the majority of people at the time either wore a tricorn or a flat brim hat, mostly made out of felt. Other things that you would have wore, generally speaking, these folks mostly went barefoot or wore moccasins. The cost and maintenance associated with keeping up with the shoe at the time probably wouldn't have been within their means. There are accounts within the Draper's manuscripts of some long hunters carrying up to 3 pairs of moccasins, which they would repair from day to day, keep up with foot covering. Wool stockings, linen stockings that were generally a solid piece of cloth woven up the back were very common. Leather leggings, canvas leggings, or wool leggings were extremely common. You did have some instances of gaiters, which is a similar garment, except they were button flies or tied up the side where these are actually sewn in the native manner. The people from the 18th century, primarily in the eastern frontier, adapted a lot of Native American clothing style, mainly just out of necessity. It required less cloth, it required less time, and it required less maintenance, not to mention it left you much lighter to be able to travel much quicker. But anyways, slightly touched on the leggings. These are leather leggings. They're tied up to protect your legs from thorns or thistles with a tong or thong tied up to a waistband to hold them up, along with garters at the slightly below the knee and right above the ankle to hold them up. The next piece of garment would be your knee breeches. Linen, cotton, sometimes silk, if you were rich enough to afford it. We weren't. Linen, silk, cotton, and other materials were used for leggings. These happen to be a pair of wool leggings that I purchased from a company and dyed with period methods using oak leaves, oak dye. The next piece of garment will be my top garment here. This is known as a hunter's frock or a hunter's shirt. There are accounts of many hunters wearing clothing like this. And as a matter of fact, it was adopted by some regular army units in the time if they didn't have access to the proper coats. But they were generally known as a large garment, large enough to make a 1-foot fold across the front. Mostly made of linen, but other materials as well, dyed however they wanted. There's accounts of yellow, there's accounts of blue, there's accounts of brown and red, but they were generally ornate with fringe and a large neck flap or collar. Okay. I'll start pulling some of this stuff off because I will tell you it's very hot.
And the fringe was not for decoration. It helped it dry quicker when it got wet.
Yep. Okay, the next piece of garment we're going to talk about is the waistcoat or waistcoat. This one happens to be of roughly a 1750 style. The way that you can tell that this is a 1750 style, earlier style, is a 20. It comes to half size. Later on in the 1770s, you would have seen garments becoming shorter, which we actually have an example of it over here that I can show after. But this one in particular happens to be a 1750 style. Now, we do know that fashion traveled fairly fast even across the frontier. There are accounts.
Thank you. Will you come a little bit just a little bit closer? Yeah, thank you. Like you're on a runway.
There are later accounts in the 19th century of fashion making it from France all the way up into Missouri or Kansas in a matter of 2 weeks. Although fashion wouldn't have been a high priority for these people on the eastern frontier. It was very common for people to wear older fashion. Essentially, we're talking about 1769 at the time that Boone was coming here. It wouldn't have been uncommon for the majority of these people to still be holding on to the older fashion of the longer waistcoat, and other garments that were more so for the time period. Economic status decided a lot of this. And also necessity. This one itself happens to be made of wool. They were also made of linen and other material. Under this is a heavy linen shirt. The basic shirt, this would have been your everyday shirt. This would have been your night clothes. This would also have been your underwear. It's long enough to hang to the knees. Whenever you put your clothing on, you just wrap it up around sort of like a diaper, pull your breeches over top of it, and there you go. Outside of that, you've got moccasins. Like I said, these were very commonly worn in the time period. Shoes were a lot to keep up with. You might wear out a pair of shoes over a long hunt, and then how are you going to replace it? Outside of that, we've already touched on the hat. We've already touched on the shirt here. We'll start going to things that you would have carried on your person. Primarily, the main thing that you would have wanted was a rifle or a rifle gun. This one happens to be in the Virginia style. It's 40 caliber flintlock rifle. A lot of people think that in the time period, especially in the eastern frontier, the guys would have carried smooth bore muskets. That's just incorrect. They were very popular in the northern territories where livestock and farming had already taken over, that you had to think about the areas that these guys had settled. They had just taken over land that they were trying to convert to farmland from wilderness. It's rocky, it's stumpy, there's trees everywhere, which is why a lot of the reason they settled on companion gardening or hoe gardening. They hoe up a spot in a circle, plant everything together, and there you go. So with that being said, raising livestock was less of an option, so they needed an option that would allow them to take game at larger distances and through growth. Of course, the rifle flintlock was an invention of that.
Tell them what rifle means, what it calls the ball to do.
Okay, what the rifle and the barrel does is there are grooves cut into the barrel itself. So whenever that you force the charge into the barrel and you shoot it and it expands out, it causes the ball to twist. This stabilizes the ball itself and makes a weapon more accurate.
Was it a ball or did they use also cylinders or something modern?
Was
it always a ball they shot? I mean, was it a lead ball or were they also in a different shape?
No, you did get conical bullets later on in the 19th century, but in the 18th century, the round ball was the most common. Now, if you were talking about a smoothbore musket or a fowling piece, you may see instances of guys shooting shot, like a shotgun. Or there are accounts of guys, once they run out of shot, just picking up whatever they had on the ground and making it work. There's actually an account of a guy attempting to take down the elk with his last shot, and the elk didn't fall. So as a last resort, he pulled a screw from his flint, handed it down the barrel, finished the elk off, and whenever he dressed the animal, retrieved his screw and assembled his flintlock back together. These accounts are found in the Draper's manuscript. But this happens to be a 40 caliber rifled flintlock. Generally, rifle guns at the time period were anywhere from 32 caliber up to 53. They were generally a lot more, smaller bores than what you would expect of a smooth bore musket of the time period. But these guns were primarily found in Virginia, southern Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and South Carolina, which happened to have heavy German settlement, which is where a lot of this technology comes from. The English and the French weren't concerned about being able to shoot it long distance, because their engagements were much closer, as was, the practice of the gunsmiths in the area. They primarily messed with livestock as a means of procuring meat. In Germany, though, that was a little different. And with the heavy German settlement in here, they brought a lot of the rifles along with them as far as the gunsmiths went. But this would have been your primary tool. You wouldn't have want to left home without this. This was your means of defense. This was your means of procuring meat. This was the means of your livelihood through essentially the first grade.
Tell them, Scott, about what it means to be a flintlock.
The flintlock itself has to do with the ignition of the weapon itself. A modern weapon is a cartridge weapon that has a primer inside the case that helps ignite the charge. Later on in the 19th century, you had the introduction of cap guns, which was essentially the same thing as this, except the ignition device had a cap, and that's what set it off. This actually uses a piece of flint that's harvested from the ground and worked up to the shape that it is in order to be able to set the charge off. Essentially what you would do is place your powder charge in here, take a bit of tow and your ball, tamp it down tight, a little bit of powder in the pan, pull your prism back, pull back your, and then throws the spark and sets off the charge.
Hopefully,
If your powder's dry, Lord willing.
keep your powder dry.
Okay, the next tool that we can talk about, the second most important tool for the time period, would have been your knife. This is your means of tanning hides. This is the last ditch means of self-protection. This can be used to manufacture things that you may need along the way, including shelter or other things, as well as your eating utensils. This happens to be a Jeff White reproduction of a skin and knife from the time period. Generally, they weren't worn with belt loops or anything like that. They were just tucked in your belt, and there you go. Very, very commonly used and well documented. The next piece that you may see is some type of belt tie. This one happens to be an English style tomahawk. They were well documented at the time period, but there are many examples. For example, this happens to be an original from the 18th century spiked belt tie, minus the handle. Happens to be a piece from my own collection. But these were used for a lot of the same thing. If you needed to put up a station camp, build a shelter, whatever you needed, and as a last ditch, they were also a weapon. The accounts of guys throwing these, as far as white settlers, are highly unlikely. That was generally something viewed as a boy's gun. Boys may walk through the woods, throw this at a tree or a stump in order to gain accuracy and proficiency, but that's essentially that. The next piece of gear that we see here is the shooting knife. This would have carried everything that you needed in order to maintenance, in order to shoot and maintain that flintlock. This one happens to be of a Virginia style made of buffalo leather. It's two pocket, which I'll be honest, was not correct for the time period. Most of them were non-gusseted, single pouch. Things that you would have kept in here: ball bag with round ball. That's your bullets. A bit of tow or patch. Some grease to grease it with. Extra flints. Cleaning tools. and other things of the sort. You wouldn't want to drop this. That's your means of keeping that weapon alive and keeping yourself alive. Next thing we'll talk about is the powder horn. This would have been your means of keeping your powder dry or as dry as you possibly could. Transporting your powder across long distances and all that. There's two examples here. This would have been more so a day horn or a primary horn. This would have been a primary horn from the time period. The next piece of kit we're going to talk about is the haversack. There are multiple ways that people carry their gear in the time period. The haversack just happens to be one of them. This is a single strap, goes over the shoulder, worn as so. Another thing that you may have seen in the time period is a knapsack, which is essentially the same thing, but instead of having one big strap, you would have had two straps across the back and wore it like a backpack. Or a knapsack, which is essentially like the modern double bag. Thrown across the shoulder, it's just one big sack with a cinch across the end. Or this example here of a linen reproduction market wallet. It's essentially just a big double-sided bag with a split in the middle. You would put your contents in on one side, on the other, spun it up, throw it over your shoulder, and that's how you pack your stuff. That's just a few examples of the ways that you would pack your stuff if you were carrying things on your person. The next piece of kit we're going to talk about is the breastplate. Modern day long hunters and reenactors generally pack some type of tent with them. This wasn't uncommon for the time period. Washington himself was even accounted of carrying tents, and in one occasion moving towards the south, packing the ditches tent and sleeping in a match coat, which is essentially just a wool blanket wrapped around you and tied at the waist and clipped at the top. But long hunters ourselves, they came in, they built something from the land, and that was that. The things that you would have carried would have been your wool blanket. This one happens to be fashioned up with a piece of 1/4-inch hemp line, period for the time, fashioned into a tump line, but a lot of hand weave tump lines were used. Inside this, wrapped inside of it is an extra shirt, an extra pair of stockings, and 2 more pairs of moccasins. As we spoke earlier, 3 pairs of moccasins is common. But that's the bedroll. That would have been your extra coat in cold weather. That would have been sometimes your shelter if you didn't have time to provide one for yourself. And that would also been your bed and your cover. Outside of that, that makes up the majority of the kit that you would have seen at the time. Now, inside of the haversack itself, things that you might have carried is some provisions as far as food. It was not uncommon to carry a bag of meal, whether that be rye, barley, wheat, or cornmeal. In some cases, cornmeal was actually very popular. A bit of jerk, something like that. Other weapon maintenance things like lead ladles, bullet molds, extra rags in order for cleaning your weapon system, things of that type. Another thing that you would have carried on your person would have been what's known as a husset or a housewife. This is an 18th century term used for a sewing kit. Most of these were generally fashioned out of some type of fabric, whether it be wool or linen, into a folded configuration to where that you could keep everything that you needed to sew with. There are accounts of soldiers in the time period using horns, calf horns, as hussets. But this example here happens to be one fashioned out of a piece of leather. The next piece of kit we're going to talk about is a tinder bag or fire kit. This one happens to be fashioned out of a piece of bark tan. I made it myself. Hand cut lace. Inside this kit, you'll have some type of tin in order to make tinder or char. A piece of fat wood, which fat wood is the inner piece of wood from a sappy type tree, whether it be pine, spruce, something of the sort. that tar inside of that, or that sap inside of that is highly flammable and will aid it, especially in wet weather trying to start a fire. You may have had tow or flax inside of this, along with other materials and flint and steel. Speaking of, I'll pull the flint and steel out to give an example of, so this one happens to be roughly 5 inches long and 9 inches high with a flat at the top, rolled in a manner to try to keep the contents as dry as possible. And also waterproof because it's greased down and waxed. This happens to be a char tin. There are many different types of char tin. At the time, anything that would have kept water out would have been suitable. Inside of this, you got some pieces of tow and flax. You have some small pieces of char cloth in here, which is just pre-charred material. You put it inside of this container. So long as it doesn't have oxygen, it can't burn, but it will char, turn black, and this stuff will take a spark and a heartbeat. Along with it, you've got a flint or a steel rather. This would have been your ignition device to use with a piece of flint, much like the flintlock sparks with flint off a prism. This is essentially the same concept. When flint meets steel and hit, it sparks, and there you start your fire. Another piece of clothing that I forgot to mention while we were going over the clothing section is the breech cloth. Or the breech cloth. This would have been a native garment that was actually, believe it or not, adapted by the English extensively in the Eastern Frontier. There's a lot of documentation of this. This one is a little larger, believe it or not, than period examples. These were generally roughly a yard long and 9 inches wide. They would saddle themselves with it, pull it up, fashion a belt around the center, and use the extra pieces of each side as a flag. What some people call, pardon my French, a butt flag. But these were very common with natives at the time. These were adopted by people in the Eastern Frontier, long hunters especially, and there are accounts of Washington in some of his volumes. His journals speaking about the fact that he allowed some of his troops to wear these, and if it wasn't, I forget the wording that he used. But essentially, he would allow his officers to wear these same things, if not for the fact of their status. Just for the simple fact that it allowed them to carry extremely light, move extremely quickly, and it was that much less than money. But this happens to be a breech cloth. They were commonly made out of horse linen or wool with some type of banding around the end to prevent fraying. And a lot of them were a little more ornate with some type of rudimentary embroidery. This one happens to be plain. Other things that you would have seen inside of your haversack. This is, by the way, this is an example of a grain sack at the time for a mill sack. This one happens to be stuffed with newspaper right now because I didn't want to bring food into the winter. Other things that you may have carried, your mess kit. My mess kit consists of a tin cup. This would have been very shiny at the time that it was made, but through wear and use it rolls out. There are accounts of guys bringing in trade kettles in the time period, but generally that was something that was reserved for larger groups. 5 or 6 men may carry one kettle and use that to make their meal. Most guys on their own would have just cooked right here in this cup or off of a stick and ate with their knife or drink directly from it. Other things that you may see for the time period, some type of chain or some type of cordage in order to tie up 3 sticks to make a tripod for cooking with a pot and an S-hook, which happens to be hiding in here somewhere. Just a steel S-shaped piece and some type of cloth in order to keep the stuff clean. Something we can lightly touch on is hygiene at the time period. Unfortunately, they weren't known for the best hygiene. American settlers at the time were commonly known to wash their clothing, but not themselves. There are accounts of sometimes people only bathing twice in their life. Now, we differed from the natives in this stance, as the natives washed frequently, but they didn't wash their clothes. So kind of the opposite side of the spectrum there. So as far as carrying hygiene items, most likely a horn comb, something to keep your hair cleaned up. Now, to touch on hair at the time period, it was very uncommon for people to be bearded or long haired. It was very common for people to wear wigs at the time period. Why is this? Does anybody know? That's right, lice. Lice was very common in the time period, and the best way to maintain the absence of lice on the body is no hair. Now, it was not uncommon in the time period for long hunters to come in and throw that side of things away and not shave and not cut their hair while on the hunt. But there are many accounts that when they come back, just shy of town, they would stop and shave their face and cut their hair. There's one account of Boone not doing this whenever he returned to the Yakin battle and walking up and asking for a dance from his wife, and his wife didn't recognize him to the point that she smacked him open-handedly across the face. This is fine. Another thing that most long hunters would carry at the time, some type of extra cloth or some type of extra leather. You need a way to maintain your clothing. Clothing gets teared, clothing gets holed, moccasins get holed. You have to have some type of way to fix that stuff. Of course, your husband and your sewing kit was one part of that, but also extra material. This happens to be a piece of deer bark that I carry in my kit. Something else that may not have been as common, but I do carry in my kit, is an 18th century compass. Most of these folks were well enough in the woods that they knew their way around. They could travel by landmarks, they could travel by the stars, they could travel by the sun. They knew which way was west, north, east, south. But in some accounts, if you were trying to map, you would have needed a compass. This happens to be a reproduction brass 1750s compass. Same basic concept as a modern compass. It just happens to be the time period. This one actually has the sundial in it to tell time. It's a little nicer example. But outside of that, that really makes up the majority of the long hunter's kit as far as what they would have carried on their person. Now, understanding that these guys came in decent sized groups, generally no less than 4 or 5 people, but there are accounts of guys coming in with upwards of 30. They would have brought things along with them. There's a lot of misconceptions that long hunters in the time period essentially run everywhere on foot, carry everything on their back, and that was that. These are misconceptions. It's well known that long hunters generally traveled by horseback, and where that they couldn't, they traveled by foot. You have to think about the reasons why that they were in here trying to procure hides. How would they carry hundreds of pounds of hides on their back all the way to Virginia? They simply wouldn't. So it was not uncommon for a guy to be accompanied with a couple pack horses and pack mules. They load these things up with the essential tools that they needed coming in, sometimes anvils, sometimes blacksmithing tools, not every time, but there are documents or documentation of these things being carried in, and then having the opportunity to have that pack horse to carry out your hides whenever your hunts were over with. Generally, these hunts lasted from late fall to early spring. You're talking winter time. But as we spoke previously, there are accounts of Boone and some others in here playing upwards of a year or more. Outside of that, another accoutrement that I happen to pack, tobacco was commonly used as what little bit of time they had for recreation at the end of the day. A lot of guys smoke, unfortunately. This happens to be a tobacco bag that I fashioned out of a hair-on pocket tan skunk. Inside of it, you have a tobacco flask, you have a pipe, and all the things that you need to maintain that. Outside of that, That's essentially my kit. That's the things that I carry, and these are at least representations of things that long hunters would have carried in here at the time. Outside of that, I guess we can talk a little bit on the long hunter themselves. Yes,
You said they carried a bullet mold and a ladle. Where'd they come up with the lead that they made the new bullets out of?
they carried the lead with them.
They carried the lead too?
Bar,
Yeah.
bar, you,
Generally 5 pounds per person. Now, understanding that lead was a hard commodity to come across in the eastern frontier, it was not uncommon for them, once they harvested a kill, to get their lead ball back out of that and recast it into a new lead ball. Essentially recycling. There are accounts at Boonesboro. Whenever the blackfish attack Boonesboro, they come in and whitewash the outside of the fort itself in order to be able to more easily retrieve the lead balls that were shot into it because their supplies were so low. Essentially just the recycle system. Yeah.
at one instance, they took over 150 pounds of lead out of the wall.
But outside of that, I think that's about all I have for now. If we have additional questions or other things that Skip wants to talk about, I'll turn it back over to him.
I've already got two. Someone asked, what did they hunt?
Primarily bison, elk, and deer. The red deer primarily was worth more, which the same whitetail deer that we think of, it's a summertime deer. But these guys weren't generally in here in the summertime, which is probably the reason why that the red deer prices reflect being higher than normal. They did do other trapping and other game, but primarily the large wildlife would have been what they would have focused on because you gain more for one kill that way. You would have brought these hides back to Virginia and sold them in the market, and that's how you would supplement your income to keep your family alive.
The next one, did they make and repair their own clothing or were they made by the women?
There are actually instances of both. The used clothing trade in that time period was actually rather large, hand-me-down clothes being sold at markets and stuff like that. But a lot of people did make their own clothing. There are accounts of bundles of clothing being brought into Boonesboro, pre-dyed, put together as garments, and then sent back to Virginia and sold in market. But a lot of people did make their own, and some did buy their own if they weren't capable of making them themselves. Next question. Oh, that's it. I'll turn it back over to Skip.
You have a question?
Yes.
I have a question. How did they build their houses?
How did they build their houses or how did they build their stations?
How did they build their houses?
Their houses?
Yeah.
Primarily they would have used these out of logs. But what they would use here primarily on their hunts would have been an actual station camp.
In that picture, see it?
These were generally 20-foot long, 16-foot wide, made with poles and forks. You would set 2 poles in the ground with forks, run a beam across the top, lay the rest of the beams across it, and a lean-to configuration in order to reflect your fire and heat back at you while inside the shelter. You would cover this shelter with either hides or bark. In some cases, there are accounts of using river canes stacked on top in order to provide a water barrier.
Someone else has a question.
I have a quick question. Besides the 5 pounds of lead, how much do you think all that would weigh, what they're carrying?
I will tell you, it ain't light. I carry most of it myself, and especially in the heat of summer with extra clothing, it's a lot to carry, but these were strong men, strong-willed men. This wouldn't have been nothing to them. You know, looking at things from a modern perspective, we think carrying 10, 15 pounds from day to day, all day long is cumbersome. They might carry 30, 40 pounds and think it's absolutely nothing. They were used to hard living. Any other questions? I'll turn it over to Skip.
But just compared to with what they're carrying, James, what's a rucksack weigh in the military now? Some of them up to 90 pounds. Yeah.
Some of them.
So, but you know, that your Rangers carry. So they were just, they were brutes. They were tough people. During, to answer your question about the ball, the round ball was prevalent up until, the turn of the century. And if you will see them advertised, they call them mini balls, and they're cone shaped. They're in the shape of a bullet, but they were actually invented by a Frenchman by the name of Monet.
Because
So-
I mean, a ball doesn't need to spin necessarily, right?
Well, that's why they put the rifling in it, so it would cut the air. It would fly truer if it were spinning when it come out of the barrel.
Yeah.
For some reason, but the French did the bullet, the cone shaped as we know today. It is almost 7 o'clock, which, as we said, I want to end on time. John Markham has some stuff here, not stuff, utensils. I don't like the word. Here's an awl that we talk about, a bone needle. Now, this was actually found. This is a deer rib. You had to have something to punch a hole with. This is made out of horn, spoon. He has a wooden spoon here. What about your pipe?
Just a clay trade pipe.
A clay trade pipe. The tobacco was actually used as money. I have here actually a flint knife that someone has made me that I'm going to leave up here. And I have a knife here that I had a guy make for me. This is made by hand. This is out of the shin bone of a deer and a saw blade. An old saw that got broke. It's actually came, and I wept the day that I found this. The shin bone actually came from this deer. I watched this deer grow up, let him walk as a 7-pointer. When he was 3 years old, the blue tongue got him. I found him bush hogging. The antlers, I used the shin bones, used the shoulder blades to make spoons, the rib bones to make awls. The natives didn't throw anything away. Every animal, and correct me if I'm wrong, they used the brain to hand the hide. Every animal has enough brain to rub on that hide to soften it, from a squirrel to a deer to a bear. If you go to Living Archaeology Weekend up at the Gorge in September, you can actually see this being done. I have up here a couple of fire starter kits. Scott has his. I actually have one that someone that was made. It has a magnifying glass in the lid, so you can start a fire with the sun if you needed to. And as he said, charcoal would be nothing but just like charcoal. You put the wood in, you keep the oxygen off of it, a piece of flint. I actually have some wood shavings and a wren's nest. If you can find an abandoned wren's nest, it makes the best fire starter that you can find. And I'm kind of running over a little bit here. I want you to some things that I have learned. There was no wheat in America, and there was no corn in Europe. And you think about that. There was no honey in America. The bee was here like the first horse. The Indians hated the honeybee because they knew when they went to the woods and found a bee tree, they called them the stinging flies, because I know the white man is but 6 months behind them. So they knew. And we haven't talked about Tecumseh tonight. And I wanted to share with the long hunters. And I think what we're going to do next week is maybe pick up right here and talk about some of our first settlers in Estill County. And we don't, like I said, we don't have a schedule, and we fly good by the seat of our pants. But when they knew that when they found that honeybee, they knew that the white man was not far behind him. Tecumseh was about 12 years younger than Boone. And next week I will talk more about Boone being captured, but they captured him at Blue Licks. They captured Boone 3 times. Probably the only white man they ever captured 3 times that lived. They took him to they took them to Chillicothe. And Tecumseh was about 12 years old when they come driving them in like cattle. And as Scott said, it was March. There was some snow on the ground and they were barefooted. Many of them were. And Tecumseh said, when I saw the salt makers being driven into my camp, my heart dropped, for I knew that our land was in trouble. The only white men I had seen were the English soldiers, and they stunk and had boils and cursed and complained all the time. But the salt makers were of a different breed. There was a brave that had lost a hand in a previous battle. And he went down there and spit on them. They spit back. He said, come on in here. We'll take that other hand. You know, they showed no fear. They stood up, but they also knew that they weren't going to be killed, because when they caught Boone, and we'll get into more of that last week, he told them, he told Blue Jacket, he said, if my men surrender, I don't want them to have to run a gauntlet that we talked about. And they said, no, we're not. We're taking them to Detroit to sell to the British. We're not going to kill them. So when they got to the camp, they started forming a gauntlet line. And Boone said, I thought you said my men didn't have to run a gauntlet. They said, they don't. You're going to run it. We didn't say anything about you. And with that, we'll close. And we'll. So we'll pick up what?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Scott Bledsoe and Mr. John. John has some things up here in a case, some metal. And I have another tool, and many of these, this is a hand adze at the same blacksmith that made some of John's things up here. If you wanted a bowl, you had to hew it out. This is a bowl that I hewed out of a piece of sassafras. I don't know how the bark stayed on, but it has. But we're going to mill around here for a little bit if you all want to come up and ask some questions and